It is January 1933, and you are 7. 12 years from now, almost everyone you love is gone. But this is not a story about numbers. It is what those 12 years felt like, because this life is yours. Rewind 2 years. You live above Papa's tailor shop in Berlin, on a loud street that smells of bread and coal smoke. Your family has been German for 200 years, and grandfather's iron cross from the Great War hangs over the fireplace. You're 8 when the men in brown appear, painting a star on the shop glass and telling customers to keep walking. Old Mr. Weber bought his suits from Papa for 20 years. Today, he stares at his shoes and crosses the street. The government calls it a boycott, and it lasts one day. But something invisible has changed and never changes back. In May, they burn books in the square, Einstein and Freud and the poets Mama loves, and the smoke reaches your bedroom. One by one, the doors close. Doctors lose their patients, teachers lose their classrooms, and Papa loses half his customers. At school, your best friend Carl stops sitting beside you because his father has joined the party. Nothing personal, he mumbles. The Nuremberg laws arrive in September 1935, and a stamp of ink says you are no longer German. And now the signs appear everywhere you go, on park benches and swimming pools, cinemas and skating rinks. For 2 strange weeks in 1936, the signs vanish. The Olympics have come to Berlin, and the city scrubs itself clean. The world's athletes and reporters look around, find it not so bad, and go home reassured. The day they leave, the signs return. Here is the strange part. Life goes on. You do homework, you fight with your sister, and people get used to almost anything. That is the trap. Each year the water gets hotter, and each year your family says, surely this is the worst of it. Some families sell everything for a visa and leave. Your parents hesitate, leave home, leave grandfather, for a madness that will surely pass. By 1937, you are expelled to a Jews-only school across the city. You learn English there, just in case, the teacher says. One by one, the boys from your class appear in new uniforms, marching and singing. Carl looks happy. You watch from the curb. 32 nations meet at Evian to discuss taking Jewish refugees. Each expresses deep sympathy, and each takes almost none. November 9th, 1938. You wake in the dark because the night sounds wrong, like hail, but the sky is clear. It is glass. Down your street, men are smashing every Jewish shop window, one after another, while the police stand and watch. From the roof, you see your synagogue burning. The firemen stand by, hosing the neighbors' houses so only the synagogue burns. That night, they arrest Papa, along with 30,000 other Jewish men, on no charge at all except being born. He comes back 6 weeks later, thinner, silent, with his head shaved. He never says where he was, and he starts selling everything. Your passports come back stamped with a single red letter J. The state wants you gone, yet makes leaving nearly impossible. The night of broken glass ends the argument in your kitchen. Everyone wants to leave now, but now it is almost too late. To flee, you need a visa, and the world has quietly closed its doors. The line outside the American consulate runs for blocks. A ship called the St. Louis sails for Cuba, carrying 900 refugees, and Cuba turns it away, and America turns it away. Your parents manage one miracle, a single seat on a children's train to England. One seat, and your little sister takes it. She waves at you through the train window like it is a holiday. You will replay that small wave for the rest of your life. September 1939. Germany invades Poland, and every border snaps shut. You are 15. The rules arrive weekly. Curfew at 8, radios surrendered, telephones forbidden, shopping 1 hour a day. News still finds a way in, whispered from kitchen to kitchen. London says the war will be short. The whispers are wrong. A new decree in 1941, every Jew over 6 must wear a yellow star, always visible. Wearing it, you become a ghost in your own city. Some people spit, and a few quietly press an apple into your hand. You turn 16 under curfew. Mama saves 3 months of sugar rations to bake something that is legally almost a cake. Papa is conscripted into forced labor. Your apartment is reassigned, and 2 more families move into your 3 small rooms. Mama trades her wedding bracelet for a winter coat and a sack of potatoes. Nobody cries. Crying is for people with time. Then the letters start. The Rosenthals upstairs get one. Report for resettlement in the east. 1 suitcase, warm clothes. They go. Weeks later, 1 postcard arrives from a place called Litzmannstadt. Strange, stiff sentences, then nothing. Nobody knows what the east means. Rumors crawl through the city. Labor camps, ghettos, worse. The mind refuses the worst. In Warsaw, 400,000 people are walled into 3 square kilometers, and children smuggle potatoes through gaps in the brick. October 1942, your family's letter comes. Grandfather polishes his iron cross. Surely this still counts for something. It does not. At dawn, you carry 1 suitcase each to the Grunwald railway station, platform 17, where a freight train waits. 100 people in a car built for 8 horses. The doors slide shut. In Berlin, your whole life disappears behind you. You travel 2 days without water. When the doors finally open, you have arrived at a place history will call Auschwitz. Floodlights, dogs, shouting in a language that is yours and is not. Leave the suitcases, they say. You never see them again. What happens on that ramp takes 5 seconds and no explanation. An officer's glove points left or right. Mama and grandfather go left. You never see them again. It takes years to learn what left meant, and a lifetime trying to unlearn it. You go right because you are young and can work. Your name is taken away, and a number is inked into your arm. The camp is built to erase the person first and the body second. Same striped clothes, same shaved heads, same gray soup. Twice a day you stand for hours to be counted, in rain and frost. The counting is not about numbers, it is about obedience. So survival becomes a quiet rebellion of small things. A remembered song, a traded button, a friend who shares his bread. The friend is called Yosef, from Prague, older, quick, stay invisible, he teaches you. Never first in line, never last. And here is what you cannot know inside the wire. From Paris to Salonika, this is happening to millions on printed timetables. Back in January 1942, 15 men in a villa by a Berlin lake settled the plan over brandy in 90 minutes. There is even a show ghetto called Theresienstadt, scrubbed and staged for a Red Cross visit, a film set with a death rate. Some fight back. In the Warsaw ghetto, a few hundred young Jews with pistols hold off the German army for nearly a month. Some hide. In Berlin, 1,700 Jews survived the entire war invisible, in attics and false walls, carried by their neighbors' courage. But mostly, there is the machinery. By 1944, it runs day and night, the world knows, and the bombers never come. January 1945. The east thunders with Russian guns. The camp is emptied, and you walk west through snow in wooden shoes. Whoever falls behind, stays behind. You count your steps in hundreds and think only of your sister in England. One April morning, the guards are simply gone. You are lying in a barracks near Bergen-Belsen when British soldiers walk in. A soldier hands you chocolate and starts to cry. You weigh 38 kilos. You are 18 years old, and you are free. The soldiers feed you slowly, a spoonful at a time, because after years of hunger, kindness itself can kill you. Free into what? Strangers live in your apartment, your street is rubble, and your language belongs to the people who did this. You write to the Red Cross, and lists are read aloud in the camps. Papa, 1943, Mama and Grandfather, Auschwitz. Of your school class of 30, 4 are alive. Of the 12 at your family's table, 2, you and your sister. In Nuremberg, some of the architects sit before judges. Many more simply take off the uniform and go home to their gardens. 6 million is a number no mind can hold. A tailor's son at a window watching torches. In 1947, you find your sister in London. She is taller than you now, and you learn each other again slowly. One photograph survives, hidden by a neighbor under a floorboard. It is the wedding picture from the mantle on your street. You live, you work, you marry, you argue, you plant a garden, and every boring, ordinary day is a small, impossible victory. Because the plan was that none of this would exist. No garden, no argument, no you. Ordinary life is the revenge. And one evening, decades later, a grandchild climbs onto your knee and asks about the faded number on your arm. You take a breath and you begin at the window. I was 7 years old, and it was January 1933. The survivors asked one thing of us, not to be sad, but to remember. Memory is the wall between this and again. Because it did not start with trains. It started with signs on benches, jokes in classrooms, and neighbors who looked at their shoes. And it was stopped, late and imperfectly, and at unbearable cost, by ordinary people who finally refused to look away. So the question this story leaves you with is not, how could they? It is quieter and harder. What would I have done?